Chapter 14 of Zhang Henshui's Cause of Crying and Laughing. Morning classes are about to be forgotten. Nostalgic rain comes again. Evening trip to Connell is better than Kia Xingba. It was said that Kuai Daozhou was patrolling Guan Shoufeng on the low wall. When he saw him suddenly falling from the ridge of the roof, he thought he had lost his footing and fell down, so he ran forward quickly. I saw Shoufeng coming forward nicely, reaching out his hand in the darkness, pretending to go. So the two of them jumped over several walls and went straight to the back garden. Kuai Daozhou said, "Master, what's going on?" Daozhou asked, "How is it? Is this a difficult matter?" Shoufeng said, "It's difficult but not difficult. If we have 300,000 foreign dollars, it will be easier to handle. Let's go out and talk." The two of them still walked to the attic, opened the window, and put down the rope. Kuai Daozhou first took hold of the rope and slid down, but Shoufeng untied the rope and jumped down. Zhang Laohai and Wang Erbalao came forward and asked hurriedly, "Is it going well?" Shoufeng sighed and briefly explained what he saw. Because he said, "If I don't look out for Mr. Fan, I will kill her with one knife. Should I save her?" Wang Erbald said, "The old saying goes well. I would rather save an animal than a human being." That's what he said. "Let's set a fire in the attic and make a fuss about it." Shoufeng laughed and said, "Don't talk like a child. Let's go and give the aunt a letter, and tell her to prepare it. Let the old lady make a fortune." Kuido Zhou said, "No. If you look at it this way, her mother probably came here once. Now that she's here, the conditions must have been agreed upon, and she may not have gone to the master's house." Shoufeng said, "Fortunately, when we go back, we can pass by her door without taking a detour. Let's take a look at it." With that said, the two of them got into the car, and the two pulled the car. Even though it was late at night, the policeman didn't pay attention. They walked all the way to Daxi Alley and stopped in front of Shen's house. "The wall here is very low." Shoufeng jumped in with a single leap. "When I got to the yard, I hid in the locust tree first. I saw that the house was dark and everyone seemed to be asleep. Then I slipped down the tree and listened close to the window, but I heard a loud cry inside. This is the upper room, of course. Aunt Shen slept here. I listened outside the west wing again, and there was also a cry. There are only 3 people in the Shen family, 1 in the Liu family and 2 at home. Of course, no one goes to his own home. While eavesdropping, I suddenly heard Aunt Shen talking in the upper room." When Shoufeng heard this, he was startled and jumped up to the tree. The yard was not big, and it was late at night, so the voices could be heard clearly. She said, "The general treats us so well. If we don't agree, it won't be justified in our conscience." Listening to the voice, it was Aunt Shen's voice. It turned out that she was talking in her sleep. After Shoufeng heard this, he sighed again, jumped out of the wall, and said to everyone, "Let's go, let's go. If we stay a little longer, I'm going to kill someone." When Kuai Daozhou heard this, he knew that the Shen family had changed their minds. If we continue to entangle, something may happen. Everyone came back to Guan's house together like a gust of wind. When he arrived at the door, Shoufeng said, "You guys have been tired for the night, so go back. Maybe there will be something else to do in the future, and I will come find you again." Wang Erbaldi said, "I'll come to hear the news tomorrow morning and see what happened to them. I won't be able to sleep tonight. Otherwise, I can talk to the master all night to get rid of the bad things in my chest." Shoufeng patted him on the shoulder and said, "You should go back like me. Don't let junior sister be unhappy." Wang Erbaldi slapped his neck and said, "You've been busy all day and night, no trouble. Let's go back with Baldi." Everyone was happy and left with a smile. Shugu had something on her mind and never fell asleep. Hearing someone talking outside the door, she knew it was Shoufeng who had returned home, so she opened the door. Shugu said, "Auntie Shen's family didn't come. What did you do?" Shoufeng went straight into the house without saying a word. Seeing that, Shugu knew that it was a failure, so she said, "It is difficult to attack a general's house surrounded by guards." Shoufeng said, "Why is it so difficult to attack? As long as they are willing to come out, 10 girls can do it." Rescued. Shugu said, "How is it? Have the two of them changed their minds?" Shoufeng said, "Why not?" Then he told her what happened tonight. She sighed and said, "From now on, I know that the saying people's hearts can change people's hearts is false. It's just gold changing people's hearts." Shugu said, "Is there such a thing? That girl from the Shen family is very smart. It's hard to see how they will end up like this." But Mr. Fan is so sad when he comes back, it makes him feel so sad. Shofeng sneered, you deserve to be so gray now. How about being a good person? Shugu said, with a smile. Why are you so angry? It's almost dawn. Go to bed. Shofeng said, I deserve it. Shugu said, when it gets funny, I ignore him. Shofeng took out his dry tobacco bag, put a small bowl of guandong leaves on it, took a wicker chair, sat in front of the door, and smoked while looking at the sky outside the yard. Shofeng's old temper was not that he couldn't smoke, because he was extremely angry. Now that the cigarette smokes so deliciously, it means that you are thinking about things very much. Because it was late at night, Shugu didn't say anything for fear of disturbing her neighbors. But it's strange that this matter has nothing to do with him. But when he sleeps in bed, he will think about the person involved. From now on, will Feng Shi still have the nerve to meet Fan Jiashu? Now that Jiashu is back, will he still be that obsessed with her? Logically speaking, there was no way they could get back together. If reconciliation is not possible, what should everyone do? I just pushed it down layer by layer until daybreak. There was no need to sleep anymore, so I got up and cleaned the house. In the past, when I finished my work, I would hear the sound of wooden fish chanting sutras in the temple next door, so I would hold a sutra book and do my morning prayers. Today, I haven't finished anything yet, and the sound of fish in the water next door has already started. I don't know that the old monk came early for morning class today, or that I lacked energy and delayed the time. Now there is no fire in the stove, nor is the water boiling. When my father woke up, he didn't even have time to wash or drink, so he had to forget about today's morning class. So he calmed down, boiled the tea, and then woke Shofeng up. Shofeng stood up, stretched, and said with a smile, I'm old. How can a little person sleep so hard after being so tired? Shugu said, I thought about it for a long time. I thought this matter can't be left in the dark. We have to write a quick letter to Mr. Fan. Shofeng said with a smile, you said I like to be nosy. I haven't even thought about it all night. How could you think about it all night? Is that all you have to say after thinking about it for a night? You kid is so worthless. Shugu blushed and said with a smile, why should I think about it for a night? Shofeng said, it's your fault. It's not me who said it. I know whether it's a crime or not. Shugu originally thought that she should write a letter and tell Jiashu, and also go to Shen's house to see what Aunt Shen's attitude was at this time. But after this conversation with my father, I was too embarrassed to ask. 2 days later, Zhang Laohai came to Guan Shofeng and said, Master, this is totally weird. The Shen family has moved away. I walked through the alley today and saw that the door was closed and there was a sign posted outside. When I was doing business, I asked the children who bought the candy. It was said that they moved early the first day. It's natural, and there's nothing to blame them. If you don't move away, are you still waiting for someone named Fan to come find her? Zhang Laohai said, they are so ungrateful. Master must write a letter to tell Mr. Fan. Shofeng said, I wrote a letter a long time ago. Shugu heard it in the room, and came out quickly and asked, did you write a letter? Why didn't I see you write it? Shofeng said, I have so much words to write about this incident. Aren't you looking for trouble for yourself? And I was afraid that if I didn't write it well, people wouldn't be able to see it clearly. I asked the old monk next door to write it, but he smiled and said to me, you're nosy. People tend to meddle in their own business, and the result may be more troublesome than the original party. What he said is reasonable, but how could I not ask? The old monk wrote the letter very tactfully, and he even tried to persuade me. But when a young person encounters such a frustration, it can't be explained in just a few words. Maybe he doesn't need to reply and will come in days. He's here, and I'd love to meet him. Are you still short enough to come to me? Shugu said, how many days does it take to send a letter from here to Hangzhou? Shofeng smiled and said, I have never worked in the post office, so I don't know about this. Shugu pouted and said, you old man, you don't know what's going on. When it comes to talking, it always gives me a hard time. Shofeng laughed and said, I'm telling the truth. But according to the train journey, we arrived in Hangzhou in 4 days. At that moment, Shugu walked back to her room and silently calculated the date for a while. It would take about 4 days for the letter to arrive, 4 days for departure, and another 2 days for delay, so she could arrive in Beijing in 10 days. Now it takes a few days for the letter to arrive, maybe a week or so, and it will definitely come. At that time, what was his attitude? Could he still treat others the way he did before? Shugu had such a problem in her mind, and she couldn't stop thinking about it, especially every night. She would think about it almost every time she closed her eyes. In the first few days, I chanted sutras as usual every day, but by the 7th or 8th day, my mind just became chaotic, and I couldn't restrain myself from chanting sutras. Thinking not to offend Buddha, I simply put it aside and don't use it as a pretense. When Guan Shofeng saw it, he smiled and said, "Are you tired of it too? How can it be so cheap for young people to learn Buddhism and chant sutras?" Shugu said, "How can I be tired of it? I have been feeling a little unhappy these past 2 days. I feel comfortable and put the sutra aside. I will continue to read it as usual from tomorrow." Shugu said it and kept it in mind. The next day, Shugu finished cleaning the house, took out the small sandalwood stove and put it on the table. She used a small spoon to pick a small spoonful of sandalwood powder and put it in the stove. I went to get a Buddhist scripture and came out. When I turned around, I saw the shadow of a man in a white gown flashing outside the curtain. Then the man coughed. Shugu looked outside through the hole in the window. Paper, but she didn't see it. The man's face and figure alone could prove to be Fan Jiashu. As soon as he lost his mind, he couldn't help shouting, "Sure enough, Mr. Fan is here." Shofeng heard it in the house and went out to greet him. He held Jiashu's hand and walked in all the way. Shugu stood at the door of the inner room, forgetting that she was going in to get something. He said, "Mr. Fan is here. Did you arrive today?" As he spoke, he saw that although Fan Jiashu's demeanor remained the same, his face had a slightly burnt yellow color, and the peaks of his eyebrows were tightly tied. When Shugu asked, although he smiled at the person, his eyebrows were still tightly furrowed, and he replied, "I arrived this morning." "Hello, big girl." Shugu couldn't think of what to use for the moment. When you use words to comfort others, you have to smile in return. At that moment, Shofeng asked Jiashu to sit down, and said first, "Brother, don't be discouraged. Life is just like a dream. You wake up early and you wake up late. There is no banquet in the world that lasts for hundreds of years. Don't take it to heart." Shugu smiled and said, "Don't try to persuade me yet. You have to tell me what happened in detail." Shofeng touched his beard and said with a smile, "Yeah, you can't write it so clearly in the letter. I have to. I'll tell you first." Then he raised his head and thought for a moment, then said with a smile, "Where should I start?" Jiashu said with a smile, "Whatever, I have plenty of time anyway, so I might as well talk to my uncle. Think, he is not busy today. Why was he so busy before?" I didn't say it out loud, but I smiled at him. Jiashu doesn't know where her smile comes from. He responded with a smile. After thinking about it, Shofeng hurriedly told Jiashu about his visit to General Liu's house that night. When Jiashu heard this, his face turned pale and blue, and finally, he forced a smile and said, "Money is a good thing, who doesn't love it? You don't have to blame her." Shofeng nodded and said, "Brother, you have good intentions. A girl from a poor family can't get used to this, so don't blame her for being tempted." Shugu, who was sitting on the side, suddenly blushed and shook her head and said, "You're not necessarily right. Just because she's a girl from a poor family, she can't stand money?" Shofeng laughed and said, "That's right. We just said comforting words, and forgot that there was a poor girl waiting here." Jiashu laughed and said, "No matter what kind of people they are, they can't be generalized. But I don't know how this Liu could lock Fengxi up for no reason." Shofeng said, "We didn't know this at first. We heard it from the eldest sister-in-law of the Shen family." Then he told him about the household registration and the party. Jiashu was originally very angry, but when he heard this, his face suddenly became gentle, and he nodded several times and said, "No wonder, it was a sudden disaster. A general wants to plot against a little girl. How can we resist him?" Shofeng said, "Brother, you have to think about what you said. Although a little girl can't resist a general, if he really doesn't love his money, he may not have the heart to do such a cruel thing and take the life of the girl from the Shen family. Even if her life can't be saved, she deserves to die for you because you treat her so well." I don't know how to write a story, but the master passed down 2 sentences. It is said that strong winds reveal strong grass, and turbulent times reveal loyal ministers. Only in this day and age can one see people's hearts. Jiashu sighed and said, "What uncle said may not be true. But a person who has never read books," Jiashu said here, looked at Guan's father and daughter, paused, and continued, Besides, she has never been guided by a virtuous father and brother, a virtuous teacher and friend. How can she understand these great principles? We can only blame her and be lenient. Shugu couldn't help but interrupted and said, Mr. Fan is really loyal and honest. Even at this point, he still protects the sister of the Shen family. Jiashu said, it's not that I protect her. She has done something wrong, and even if I blame her, it can't be saved. A person's conscience can only be ignored for a moment, and after a long time, he will slowly recall it. This day, I'm afraid she will feel worse than me. Shugu smiled faintly, nodded slightly, and said, you are right. Jiashu saw Shugu's disapproval, so he smiled and said, she was wrong in the first place. If she said she had no choice, why did her family rush to move away? Shofeng said, how do you know her family moved away? Did you go there first? Jiashu said, yes, I have to ask her mother first what caused this. Shofeng said, the tree rots from the bottom, and the disaster really falls from the sky. At this point, he wanted to tell him about Fengxi's relationship with the monk master and his wife. Shugu saw her father's expression and knew that this was going to happen, so she looked at her father and nodded twice. Shofeng also saw that Jiashu still wanted to protect Fengxi. He was particularly sad when he heard this, so he didn't say anything. But Jiashu asked, Uncle said that their tree rotted from the root. Could it be that they did something wrong after I went there? Shofeng said, that's not the case. It's just that they used to sing for money, so people look down on them. Jiashu was skeptical after hearing Shofeng's words, but then he thought that he left them so much money before leaving, so he shouldn't feel difficult in the shortest time. Then, Fengxi is not a mean person. Why would she do anything unlawful? Thinking of this, he didn't pursue Shofeng's words. That day, Guan's father and daughter comforted him as much as possible and kept him for lunch. After lunch, Shugu said, Dad, I think Mr. Fan is very depressed. Let's accompany him to Shichahai to cool off. Jiashu said, I haven't been to this place. I really want to see it. Shugu said, although it's not a park, the wild scenery is nice, not far from us. When Jiashu saw her say that, his eyebrows were full of joy. Speaking of playing, although he didn't have the interest today, he didn't want to refuse her kindness. Shofeng saw his hesitation and said, Mr. Fan probably left as soon as he got off the car and hasn't packed his luggage yet. The day after tomorrow is the 7th day of the 7th lunar month, and there will be more things to see in Shichahai. Jiashu then said, okay, let's go the day after tomorrow. The day after tomorrow I will definitely invite uncle and sis to go together. Shugu first thought that he was blocking the way, and it was a bit disappointing. Then she thought that he had proposed the 7th day of the 7th lunar month, and the old man was quite interesting, so she should not disappoint him, and it would be fine to go the day after tomorrow. So she replied, okay, we will wait for Mr. Fan that day, so don't break your promise. Then she smiled. Jiashu said, sis, when have I ever broken my promise? Shugu had nothing to say, so they all smiled and left. When Jiashu returned to the Tao family, Bohi had already asked the servants to pack his luggage. Jiashu returned to his room and felt that there was nothing to do. Knowing that Bohi and his wife were at home, he slowly walked to the upper room. Mrs. Tao said, with a smile, what are you so busy about? As soon as you came back to Beijing, you ran away. Did you meet Miss He? Jiashu said calmly, I was very busy, so I didn't have time to meet friends. Mrs. Tao said, that's what you did wrong. When you left, people eagerly sent you to the station, but you didn't tell them. When you came back, who are you? That miss. He must curry favor with you. Jiashu said, my cousin's wife always criticizes me on behalf of Miss He, and her reasons are very sufficient. What can I say? Then, please call Miss He to let her know. Jiashu said it, and he felt a little regretful. My cousin's wife is not a messenger, so why did he ask her to call? He was regretting this. But unexpectedly, Mrs. Tao was sitting at a long table by the horizontal window. She had already taken the extension on the table and called the He family. While talking, Mrs. Tao waved her hand to Jiashu several times and said with a smile, come, come, come. She wants to talk to you. Lena asked, I welcome you very much. Is the old lady all right? Jiashu said, she is fine. Thank you for thinking of her. Helena smiled and said, not bad. I haven't forgotten my Beijing dialect after going back to the south. Did you arrive this morning? Why didn't you send me a message earlier? Otherwise, I would have picked you up at the station. Jiashu said, I don't deserve it. Helena said, do you have time today? I'll welcome you. Jiashu said, I don't deserve it. Helena said, maybe I don't have time. Aren't you going out now? I came to see you. Jiashu said, I don't deserve it. Bohi sat down on the other side, watching Jiashu on the phone. She just smiled and interrupted. Why don't you dare to take the responsibility? Who else can take the responsibility except you? Helena said, why are you laughing? Jiashu said, my cousin is telling a joke. Helena said, what is he talking about? Mrs. Tao walked up and snatched the phone and said, Miss He, we lend this phone to people for long-distance calls, and we charge double for good friends. I think you should just come and talk in person to save money. Then she put down the phone. Jiashu said, I should go see her first when I come back to Beijing. Why let her come? Bohi laughed and said, Jiashu, I sympathize with your attitude. Your cousin's wife and I lived in your era. I was humble and submissive, but your cousin's wife dared to take the responsibility. I also ask people, in the love between men and women, why should men be in a state of surrender? Some people say that this has become a trend, and men are always controlled by women. Otherwise, why is it called courtship for a man to get a woman? If you want something from someone, of course you have to be humble and submissive. Although this is true, it doesn't make sense. Why should women be submissive? I don't want to seek love. Now I see that your situation is exactly the opposite of my situation back then, which can be regarded as a relief for us. Mrs. Tao said, so you have this in mind? No wonder you have always been so difficult to get along with me. Bohi laughed and said, how can such a thing happen? If such a thing happens, I don't have any injustice, but I just hope that others will not be like me because I have no future, so I can make fun of it. Mrs. Tao was about to say something. Jiashu said, cousin, what you said is really pitiful. If that's the case, I dare not get married. After he said this, even Mrs. Tao couldn't help laughing. After a while, Helena came in from outside with a smile. First bowed to Jiashu and asked with a smile, Auntie, how are you? Jiashu agreed, good. Then asked, when did you arrive today? You really don't want to be tired of it. I guess you have asked these questions on the phone. Is this the second time? Helena said, when you meet, you have to be polite otherwise, what to say? Jiashuan said, speaking of being polite, I just remembered. Thank you very much for the gifts, miss. He sent me. I was in a hurry when I went north this time, so I didn't bring anything with me. Helena said, how can an old man bring gifts to the younger generation? I don't deserve it. But Jiashu had already walked out while he was talking. After a while, he came back with an armful of things, put them all on the table, and said with a smile, the small package is a local product, the lotus root powder and tea leaves brought from Hangzhou, and the 2 big rolls are some new fabrics I bought in Shanghai. Helena kept saying, I don't deserve it. I don't deserve it. Bohi heard this and smiled at Mrs. Tao. Helena said, what are you laughing at? Are you too polite again? Mrs. Tao said, it's not that you are too polite, but that you are being polite in an interesting way. When we talked on the phone before, Jiashu said a lot that he didn't deserve it. Now that you have met, you have said a lot that you don't deserve it. You said you didn't deserve it, but in fact, you deserve it. Bohi leaned on the sofa, raised his right leg, swayed it a few times, held Zuero in his mouth, and smiled at Mrs. Tao. What do you dare to be? What do you not dare to be? Being an official? Being a lawyer? Being a teacher? Mrs. Tao did not understand what he meant at first, but later he gave 2 examples, and she understood. She smiled and said, what do you mean? Just being a friend. Helena pretended not to hear, and seeing the chatterbox in the corner of the room, she smiled and asked, have you bought any new movies? If you have, take them out and let me listen to them. I want to buy some too. Mrs. Tao smiled and nodded, and said, okay. I bought 2 new love song movies and I can play them for you to listen to. Helena shook her head and said, no, I'm tired of this. I can try some Peking opera movies. Bohi still swayed his right leg and smiled. Miss He, are you tired of the word love? Don't. At your age, it's just normal. If you were all tired of love, like us middle-aged people, you should go into the mountains to learn Taoism. But no, our days of love are very sweet. Mrs. Tao turned around and glared at him, and said, don't talk nonsense. Helena put her palms together, bowed to the air, and said with a smile, Amitabha. Mr. Tao also has a manager. Then everyone laughed. Jiashu sat aside, always silent. When he saw Miss He thought of Fengxi, who looked similar to her. Miss He's appearance was only slightly thinner than Fengxi's, and she was too fashionable, which made her lose the beauty of a virgin and natural beauty, and she became just a fake foreign lady. But that was when they first met. Later, I saw her, sometimes very fashionable, sometimes very simple. Just like today, she was only wearing a sky blue straight silk long gown, and her long hair that used to fall to her shoulders was the most unpleasant thing for Jiashu. He thought it was not beautiful, but also cumbersome. Jiashu discussed this in front of Mrs. Tao days before he left, but he never told Helena. But today she cut her long hair and changed it to a double hook style that was tied to her temples. In this way, her posture was different, and her face looked more beautiful, more like Fengxi. I was just admiring her here, and suddenly I saw her raising her hands to chant the Buddha's name, and I thought of Guan Shugu again. She has a different attitude of a girl. She will stay if it suits her, and leave if it doesn't. Helena and Fengxi are different, but they are both lingering. Fengxi has a little girlish attitude, and is a little naive. Helena is different. She is used to socializing and is very worldly. She can see through a man's mind without saying a word. This kind of woman, if good, is the only confidant in the world. If not, the man will let her play with her. Jiashu just thought so deeply, and he didn't pay attention to what the people in the room were talking about. At this time, Bohi looked at the clock and said, "It's time. I have to go to the government office." "Where are you going?" "To have fun this afternoon. I will invite you to dinner later. It's still so hot this afternoon. Let's go to Beihai to cool off, okay?" Helena said, "That's it. I will be the host, and treat you three to dinner." Mrs. Tao laughed and said, "You want to treat me too? I don't deserve it." Helena laughed and said, "I don't know what's wrong with Mrs. Tao. She always likes to make fun of me. Even if it's an irrelevant thing or an irrelevant word, it's very funny to Mrs. Tao." Bohi said, "In this world, if you meet people like you are not enough to be the material for talking and laughing. Then, the jokes in the world will sometimes run out." After saying that, he left with a smile. Mrs. Tao felt uneasy when she heard that there was a date to go out and play, so she said, "Did Miss He come by car? Let's go in your car together." When she said that, she looked at Jiashu and said, "Let's go, sir. I'm interested in going out to play." But they were all so happy, and said they wanted to go. It would be a shame to stop them from going out. She stood up lazily, stretched her waist, and just smiled at the two of them. Mrs. Tao said, "What are you doing? It doesn't matter if you don't take me with you. You can go with me first, and I'll follow you." Jiashu said, "Where did you get that? I didn't say anything. How do you know I don't want you to go with me?" Mrs. Tao smiled and said, "Can't I see through your character? I'm an old hand." Jiashu said, Okay, let's go together." So she stood up without waiting for Mrs. Tao to speak. The three of them took the car to Beihai. As soon as they entered the door, Mrs. Tao met a few girlfriends and went over to talk. She turned her head and said to Helena, "The sun is shining on the south bank now. You can go to the north bank Wulong Pavilion to wait for me." After that, she left. Lena and Joshua walked north along the east coast, passing Chongdao Island. The locust trees on the east coast were soaring into the sky, rubbing against the setting sun on the west side of the lake. The green leaves were covered with golden yellow on both sides. The east side was avoiding the sunlight and became even gloomier. One tree was connected to another, and the cicadas on one tree were connected to the cicadas on another tree. Under the tree was a road several feet wide. To the east was a hill covered with wild grass, and to the west was the North Sea with endless green lotus. The more I felt that this ancient locust tree had no commercial atmosphere. The tree was tall, the road was long and straight, and people walking under the shade of the tree seemed much smaller. Lena said with a smile, "Miss Tofan, what are you thinking about? I see that although you came out to play today, it was very reluctant." Joshua said with a smile, "You are worrying too much. I am enjoying the scenery here." Lena said, "I don't quite believe this. Would a person who just came from West Lake be intoxicated by the scenery of Beihai?" Joshua said, "No, West Lake has the advantages of West Lake, and Beihai has the advantages of Beihai. West Lake does not have a locust tree forest like this one that surrounds the lake and the mountain. Then he pointed forward and said, "Look at the red wall on the north bank, matched with glazed tiles, against the green. The sunlight setting in the sea is reflected between the trees. It is so beautiful. It is simply a wonderful colored picture. Not only the West Lake, but also Beijing and the whole world has such a beautiful view. When I returned to Hangzhou, I felt that those who built villas in the West Lake were really stupid. Instead of building such a beautiful oriental house, they built many Western-style buildings, especially those Western-style hotels. They are so vulgar. If they also built pavilions with red walls and green tiles in the style of palaces, it would definitely be better than Western-style buildings." Helena smiled and said, "I know this very well. You are very fascinated by the beauty of Beijing, especially the human aspect." Jiashu had to smile. As they were talking, they had arrived in front of the Five Dragon Pavilion on the north bank. Because the last pavilion had fewer people, they sat down on a tea table near the water. They sat there from the time the sun set over the water until the sky was full of stars, but Bohi and his wife did not come. Jiashu could not wait any longer, so he walked out of the pavilion and walked towards the avenue. Only then did he see the couple walking side by side, slowly strolling over from the waterside. Mrs. Tao spoke first. "Have you finished talking? Bohi found me on the south bank a long time ago. I wanted you to talk more, so I sat in Yilin Hall for a while, and then came here by boat." Jiashu wanted to argue, but he had nothing to say, so he was silent. After sitting in the pavilion, Mrs. Tao said, "Bohi, what did I guess? Isn't it the fifth pavilion? Only here is peaceful and good for chatting." Helena felt that their guess was far away, so she laughed. At that moment, Helena hosted and accompanied everyone to have dinner. It was already late at night. The stars in the sky were inverted in the water without lotus leaves, revealing the sky, but rippling. There were a few red lights moving on the water, which were the small pleasure boats crossing the sea. Looking at the long corridor of Yilin Hall from a distance, the rows of electric lights on the upper and lower floors were reflected in the water, and the carved railings and stone masonry were also faintly visible. Bohi smiled and said, "Every time I see the night scene of Yilin Hall on the north bank, I feel homesick." Jiashu said, "Why?" Bohi said, "I remember when I was a guest in the upper reaches of the Yangtze River. Every time I boarded a river boat, it was at night. Doesn't this look like a river boat anchored in the middle of the river?" Helena smiled and said, "Mr. Tao, you are so good at describing it. It's so lifelike." Bohi said, "I have another feeling. Every time I enjoy the cool air in Beihai, I feel that the stars in the sky here are interesting in a different way." Jiashu said, "Originally, this place is very spacious, with trees all around and water in the middle, which sets off well." He smiled and said, "No, I think the Milky Way in the sky is particularly bright here. If the river is only as wide as the North Sea, if I were the cowherd and the weaver girl, I would not dare to cross it on the back of a magpie. Besides, the Milky Way is definitely not just this wide." Jiashu smiled and said, "Nonsense." Mrs. Tao was also listening in a daze, thinking that she had some feelings about the Milky Way here, but now she understood and smiled and said, "You are really crying while listening to storytelling and worrying about the ancients. Now the sky is also an era of material civilization, with ships, trains, and airplanes. Are you afraid that it will be difficult to cross the river?" "I guess it was the cowherd who crossed the river first this year, because he came by train." Bohi said, "That's right. The cowherd crossed the river early on the 5th day of the first lunar month. At this time, maybe they met." Mrs. Tao raised her head and looked, and said, "I saw them. They were sitting under the pavilion by the water, drinking soda." At this time, Jiashu and Helena both took glass cups and drank soda. Helena couldn't help laughing when she heard this. She raised her head and sprayed the soda on Mrs. Tao's stockings, soaking them. Then she laid one arm across the tea table and leaned on it, laughing uncontrollably. Mrs. Tao said, "There's nothing funny about this. Why are you laughing like this?" Helena said, "You're making fun of me like this, and I'm not allowed to laugh?" As she said this, she raised her head and wiped her face with her handkerchief. Jiashu was used to seeing Bohi and his wife joking around, but today was the first time he had seen such an obvious joke. And Lena was in front of him. It was embarrassing for a young lady to be joked like this. But looking at Helena laughing like that, she didn't feel embarrassed at all. So this new type of woman had a different attitude. When Bohe saw that everyone had nothing to say, he thought for a while and then said, "Actually, what I said just now was not completely a joke. I heard that the organizer of Beihai Park will hold a double 7th party on July 7th. They will use electric lights to build a magpie bridge in the middle of the water and set up river lanterns in the water. That night will definitely be lively. Will you to come?" Jiashu said, "I don't like to go to places that are too lively. Let's talk about it later." Helena didn't say a word, but after he said that, she held back. Mrs. Tao said, "You like to visit elegant places. Next Sunday, let's go to Baidehi to bathe in the sea, okay? We don't have to stay in a hotel. There, we know General Manager Chen. He has a villa there, which is much more convenient." Helena said, "If there is such a good place, I will go there too." Jiashu said, "I can't play anymore. I have to do some homework and prepare for the exam. If I can't get into a school, it will be meaningless for me to rush back to Beijing this time." Bohe said, "Don't worry. With your level, you can definitely get into the school. If you rush back to Beijing and it's just like this, it will be meaningless." Bohe said this. Although he didn't guess his thoughts completely, he couldn't help but feel infinitely touched. He looked at the Milky Way in the sky and said nothing. Helena could guess most of Jiashu's situation. She sat on the chair opposite, looking at him, just eating white melon seeds, and didn't say anything. After a while, she suddenly sighed. Her sigh surprised everyone. Mrs. Tao first asked her why. Her answer will be explained next time. Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.